Hello everyone, I'm Detective Sarah. Today I'm bringing you one of the most extraordinary cases in modern criminal history. A case that spans 4 decades, terrorized entire communities, and was finally solved using groundbreaking technology that didn't exist when the crimes were committed. Imagine living in fear for over 40 years, knowing that a dangerous criminal who attacked your community was still out there, possibly living a normal life, never facing justice. That was the reality for hundreds of victims and their families in California. Between 1974 and 1986, a single individual committed over 50 home invasion attacks, 13 murders, and more than 100 burglaries across California. He operated under different names: the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, and finally, the original Night Stalker. For decades, law enforcement had no idea these were all the same person. The technology to connect the cases simply didn't exist yet. But in 2018, everything changed. This is the story of the Golden State Killer and how modern science finally brought him to justice after 40 years of freedom. Our story begins in 1974 in the quiet agricultural town of Visalia, California. Between April 1974 and December 1975, the community experienced an unprecedented wave of burglaries, over 100 incidents in just 20 months. But these weren't typical burglaries. The perpetrator, who became known as the Visalia Ransacker, displayed unusual behavior patterns that disturbed investigators. He would break into homes but often wouldn't take valuable items. Instead, he would ransack rooms, go through personal belongings, and take small, seemingly insignificant items, photographs, pieces of jewelry with sentimental value, personal documents. What made these incidents particularly disturbing was the evidence that suggested the intruder would sometimes stay in the homes for extended periods, going through drawers, looking at family photos, and in some cases, taking items of clothing. Law enforcement recognized they were dealing with someone who was escalating. This wasn't just about theft. This person was deriving some psychological satisfaction from invading people's private spaces. On December 10th, 1975, the situation turned deadly. Professor Claude Snelling heard noises outside his home and confronted a masked intruder attempting to kidnap his daughter. The intruder shot Professor Snelling, who sadly passed away from his injuries. The kidnapping attempt failed, and the perpetrator fled. A few days later, a police officer attempted to stop a suspicious person matching the intruder's description. The suspect fired at the officer, narrowly missing him, and escaped into the night. After this incident, the Visalia Ransacker Crimes suddenly stopped, but the perpetrator hadn't stopped. He had simply moved to a new hunting ground. In June 1976, just 6 months after the Visalia Crimes stopped, a new series of incidents began in Sacramento County, about 200 miles north. The pattern was similar, but had evolved into something far more dangerous. The attacker, who became known as the East Area Rapist, would break into homes in the middle of the night, often while residents were sleeping. His method of operation showed disturbing sophistication and planning. He would study neighborhoods for days or weeks before attacking, learning residents' schedules and routines. He would sometimes call victims beforehand with hang-up calls or make threatening calls after the incidents. During home invasions, he would wake victims by shining a flashlight in their faces. If there was a couple in the home, he would separate them, often binding the male victim securely and placing dishes on his back, threatening that if he heard the dishes fall, he would harm the female victim. His preparation was meticulous. Investigators discovered that he would often unlock windows or doors during earlier reconnaissance visits, creating easy entry points for later attacks. He sometimes left ligatures pre-tied in yards, ready for use. Between 1976 and 1979, over 50 such incidents occurred across Sacramento, Contra Costa, and other Northern California counties. The attacks caused widespread fear throughout the region. Neighborhoods that had once felt safe became places of terror. Law enforcement launched massive investigations, but the perpetrator seemed to stay one step ahead. He wore masks or disguises, used gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, and showed an uncanny ability to avoid capture even during intensive patrol operations. Witnesses described him as a white male, likely in his mid-20s to early 30s, athletic build, around 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches tall. But despite massive public awareness campaigns and hundreds of tips, he remained unidentified. Then, in 1979, the attacks in Northern California suddenly stopped. Once again, he had vanished. In October 1979, about 6 months after the Northern California attacks ceased, a new series of incidents began in Southern California, specifically in Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange counties. These cases were initially investigated as separate incidents with no known connection to the Northern California crimes. The perpetrator's methods had evolved again, and now his crimes included murder. The first known case in this series occurred in October 1979 in Goleta, near Santa Barbara. A couple was attacked in their home. This time, the outcome was fatal for both victims. Over the next 7 years, similar incidents occurred across Southern California. The pattern was consistent with the earlier Northern California cases: midnight home invasions, meticulous planning, use of ligatures. But now the violence had escalated significantly. Investigators in Southern California called this perpetrator the original Night Stalker, unaware that they were actually dealing with the same individual who had terrorized Northern California years earlier. The final known incident attributed to this perpetrator occurred in May 1986 in Irvine, Orange County. After this, the crime stopped completely. The perpetrator seemingly vanished into thin air. For the next 32 years, the case went cold. Hundreds of investigators worked on these cases over the decades. Task forces were formed and reformed. Evidence was reviewed countless times. But without DNA technology that could effectively analyze the evidence, and without a suspect in the database to compare it to, the case remained unsolved. The victims and their families lived with the knowledge that this dangerous individual was still out there, possibly living a normal life, perhaps even raising a family, while they continued to suffer from the trauma he had caused. By the 2000s, advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to connect the Northern and Southern California cases. They confirmed what some had suspected: the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. A detailed DNA profile existed from crime scene evidence, but running it through criminal databases produced no matches. The perpetrator had either never been arrested or had committed his crimes before DNA collection became standard practice. The case seemed destined to remain unsolved. Then, in 2018, investigators tried something revolutionary. Detective Paul Holes and FBI attorney Steve Kramer decided to use a technique called genetic genealogy. Instead of just searching criminal databases, they uploaded the perpetrator's DNA profile to public genealogy websites where people voluntarily submit their DNA to find relatives. The DNA profile generated matches with distant relatives of the perpetrator, third and fourth cousins who had no idea their family tree contained a dangerous criminal. Investigators then worked backward, building family trees and identifying potential suspects who matched the age, physical description, and geographic locations of the crimes. One name kept emerging: Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer who had lived in the exact areas where the crimes occurred, during the exact time periods they happened. DeAngelo had worked as a police officer in Exeter, near Visalia, during the Visalia ransacker crimes. He was fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 after being caught shoplifting. The same year, the Northern California attacks stopped. On April 24, 2018, investigators collected a DNA sample from items DeAngelo had discarded. The sample was tested and compared to the crime scene evidence. It was a match. After 44 years, 13 murders, over 50 home invasion attacks, and more than 100 burglaries, the Golden State Killer had finally been identified. On April 24, 2018, Joseph James DeAngelo, now 72 years old, was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights, California. He had been living quietly in suburban Sacramento, the same area he had terrorized 4 decades earlier. His neighbors were shocked. DeAngelo had been living as a seemingly normal retiree, a former police officer and Navy veteran with a family. No one suspected that this elderly man had once been California's most prolific serial criminal. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by DeAngelo's age and health and by the sheer number of cases spanning 4 decades. In June 2020, to avoid lengthy trials and to provide closure for victims, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and numerous other charges. During the sentencing hearing, survivors and family members of victims finally had the opportunity to confront their attacker. Over several days, they shared their stories of trauma, fear, and the decades of suffering they had endured. On August 21, 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 74 years old, having lived free for 44 years after committing his crimes. The Golden State Killer case was finally closed. The capture of the Golden State Killer represents a watershed moment in criminal justice. It demonstrated how modern technology can solve even the coldest of cases and bring justice to victims who had waited decades for answers. The use of genetic genealogy in this case has since been employed to solve dozens of other cold cases across the country, bringing closure to families who thought they would never get answers. This case also revealed something disturbing. Joseph DeAngelo had been a police officer during some of his crimes. His law enforcement training likely helped him avoid detection, as he understood police procedures and investigation techniques. For the survivors and families affected by these crimes, the arrest brought mixed emotions. While justice had finally been served, no amount of punishment could return the decades of peace and security that had been stolen from them. The Golden State Killer case reminds us that advances in science and technology, combined with the dedication of investigators who refuse to give up, can eventually bring even the most elusive criminals to justice. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Detective Sarah, and remember, justice may be delayed, but it should never be denied.